Xexizy has made an argument on the economic calculation problem before. He says he got it wrong, and now he's going on about two different types. Just listen to what he says here.
Basically, I'd made a video talking about the economic calculation problem. So I looked into it, and it turns out there are technically like two economic calculation problems. One of them is called like the knowledge problem or something, and the other is the economic calculation problem. I don't know.
Folk, when it comes down to the knowledge problem, it's a separate issue to that of the economic calculation problem. The economic calculation problem is to do with resource allocation. Now, of course, the knowledge problem, maybe I'll go into it at some time, more in depth, but the knowledge problem is something that does correlate in some regard, but you can see that he doesn't really understand.
Now, the argument says that under a full communist society in which markets have been abolished, as markets the most efficient way of determining value and allocating prices, the communist society would struggle to efficiently allocate resources and accommodate for the constantly fluctuating supply and demands of various commodities, and then use those commodities in conjunction with each other to again do things the most efficiently.
So let's just briefly cover what he's saying here. When you speak about the laws of supply and demand, that's really all of what determines price. The fluctuation happens because consumer demand changes constantly. Take for example summer clothing. You're not going to want summer clothing going into a winter period, and I suppose that depends where you live. It's not going to be the same if you're living in a place like Florida that's hot all year round compared to if you lived in somewhere like New York. Price fluctuation happens because consumers' demand changes over time. Again, that's something that Marxism doesn't acknowledge.
As without price, there's no real way to determine value. And calculation is also difficult or maybe impossible, as no one person or group of people can know everything about the supply and demand of a given commodity in society. Okay, so that's the argument, and honestly I think it's a good argument, but there are some misunderstandings on the way that communism functions. First off, it conflates it with the transitionary phase, where there is more central planning, things aren't as decentralized, and actually that transitionary phase will have either markets or a pricing system in the form of labor vouchers of some kind.
So what Xexizy doesn't understand is the fact that the Soviet Union, for example, couldn't get rid of prices. And this is what we mean by the difference between socialism theoretically to socialism in practice. Now, the theory of communism is moneyless, it's classless, and it's stateless. Because when you speak about putting socialism into practice, then of course that's why you saw the price system with this exchange in the market. You saw people buying goods, they would hand money over. Of course, in the Soviet Union, they would fix the prices. It would create surplus-based problems and shortage problems through the price floors and price ceilings and the misallocation of valuable scarce resources in relation to the economic calculation problem. And this picture pretty much sums up everything to a T. This picture shows you that capitalism is what they require in order to survive. And if you can think of economics and politics and everything down to a question of scale, sure, it's not a capitalist system, it's a strongly socialist country. They're still clinging on to the use of some form of capitalism through that of the exchange in a market. What they did destroy, however, as I say, was the information of price signals through price fixing. That was the serious problem.
But really my main problem with it is that it completely ignores the labour theory of value. I mean, if the labour theory of value was wrong, you wouldn't be having to make this argument, because the Marxists would already be proved wrong.
Marx has been proven wrong, and the reason being is because when you speak about the labour theory of value, it doesn't look at things from the Marxist perspective that prices are not endogenous, prices are exogenous. You see, the problem with Karl Marx, he viewed prices as something knowable, as if you could simply fix a price, and as if value was something objective. Value is not objective, value is subjective. So for example, you walk into a music store, not everybody is going to have the same value in the same music albums.
Rather, Marxists say that there's another metric, labour power, which determines the value of commodities.
He viewed value as something in relation to do with the quantity of labour in relation to that of the time that you would spend on working on something. Now, I'm not sure what this has got to do with the economic calculation problem. It's a separate issue. He thought value would be determined down to how many people would work on something, the quantity of labour, and the time that you would spend on producing something. Now, how does that even determine what value is?
Now, a full communist society would be extremely decentralized and actually resource abundant. So talking about economics in a resource abundant society is kind of pointless.
In a theoretical fantasy world, and that would be ideal. But in the real world, that just isn't the case. In fact, scarcity always exists. Scarcity means that people's expectations exceed the economic reality of what is available to them. He's speaking about the communist theory, the theory that there would be no government. That's all well said and done. But in the real world, when you speak about collectivism, when you collectivise property, you are centralising property. It's the same meaning. In other words, for example, if you collectivise healthcare, you're centralising it. When you collectivise education, you're centralising it, because they both mean to bring something together in a collective group. That's the basis of communism. That's what it means to have communal ownership. So it's nothing to do with decentralisation.
And there is still some degree of central planning, assuming we're going the traditional Marxist sense. But of course, it's again important to highlight that that's not the only way socialism can be. There's such a thing as market socialism, which is socialism with markets. You can have decentralized.
I will move on to an argument at some point on market socialism, which is a ridiculous claim to say the least. The market's in relation to do with capitalism. That's all you need to understand. Market socialists are just desperate socialists who are clinging on to something, trying to redefine what socialism is, because they accept the fact that the central planning never worked. In other words, socialism didn't work. The other thing is this decentralization. Again, the meaning of socialism, to socialize property, is to centralize. When you take away from private individual ownership, you are socializing property. To socialize medicine, to socialize education, to socialize agriculture, you are centralizing.
Now, a socialist society allocates resources based on their use value as opposed to their exchange value. Now, they are different things. An example of this would be diamonds. They have extremely high exchange values, but what can you really use them for outside of a small amount needed for industrial drills? And most people don't go around using industrial drills.
It's people's own right for what they wish to, buy. And again, it's all down to subjective theory. What right does it have for him to dictate to other people what they should have, etc.? He doesn't even go into the whole thing to do with the usage. So you've got all these variant different resources. They've got a variety of different uses: tables, bookcases, chairs, and they're not all the same styles. You've got all the different, styles, different colours, different wood types. So how much does he know in terms of how much resource usage you're going to use?
Two factors need to be taken into account. The use value itself is pretty contextual. Where you have commodities that have different demands differing from each individual, you can say pretty confidently that everyone is going to need food, shelter and clothing, so that's a bit more objective.
You'll find that value in terms of housing is subjective. People will go and value a certain place, they'll check it out, and for whatever reason, they might not find it suitable for them. Well, that's the issue, because you've got all different types of housing, and even then you question the place of where that house is. He just thinks if all property is just all the same value, it's, forget the fact that about supply and demand. Everybody's got a different taste in clothing. If he doesn't comprehend that, then God help us. And even the same thing with food.
But for more luxury items, in which their demand is more subjective, you need to take into account the social necessary labour time, that being the fastest time that the commodity can be produced in, and also you need to use statistical analysis for the rate of consumption for each commodity, and you can also use the kind of pricing system given by the labour vouchers, and we'll go into that in a second.
The real value is what people are willing to part with in terms of exchange. It's not just a case that you can just produce something, put it out there, and people will take it.
Now, the social necessary labour time tells you a great deal about a commodity. How quickly the commodity can be produced, the amount that you can produce in a certain amount of time, and the relative supply of the raw materials required to make it, because obviously if supply goes down, then the social necessary labour time will go up. Now, the rate of consumption that can be analysed quite easily through statistics and calculated through computers will tell you simply how much you need of the commodity to send it there.
This is desperate now, because now he's going on about artificial intelligence and to do with computers. Socialists knew they could not debunk the economic calculation problem, so they then desperately turned to this idea that computers can do it for them, that finally we've found something that can crack the problem, we can have our communism. The truth is, they can't, because computers are incapable of reading the human mind. Computers could only gather that information from consumers' demand. That requires capitalism. That's what capitalism's all about, leaving consumers to drive what production is, leaving consumers down to drive what prices are. And if consumers are not driving what production is, if consumers are not the ones determining what prices are, how the hell does a bunch of supercomputers understand the information of how much to produce, or even what resources to use, or where to allocate them? It doesn't.
And predict how much. If you have a graph of the relative rates of consumption for a commodity over a year-long period.
But that's the issue. Because if they have a relative rate of consumption, that consumption has to come from people going and, buying those things, etc., etc. In order to have such a thing like that, you would have to have a market where consumers are driving what they want. It's a case that under the communist theory, you don't have that information, and it's not consumer driven under a communist system.
You can say, okay, in winter we're going to probably need to send this much, in summer this much, blah blah blah. And if you're using computers to calculate this, you can also quite easily factor in fluctuations of the supply and the social necessary labour times for each of those values.
Fluctuations is in relation to do with price fluctuations. And how can you have price fluctuations, etc. then? You can't. And even then, as I said about the labour theory of value under Marxism, it's the rejection of prices being allowed to, fluctuate with consumer demand.
And if you're using computers to calculate this, you can quite easily accommodate in fluctuations in the supply and social necessary labour times for these commodities.
Folk, the only reason why we know there's fluctuations in the market is through price information signals. That's why socialists are utterly clueless about economics. They honestly are. They're clueless. There's no such thing as a socialist that understands fundamental basic economics. They honestly do not understand how important prices are. They don't understand that the only reason we know that a resource goes into a shortage, prices told us that information. Prices also tell us the fluctuation because it's the prices itself that fluctuates. So we know what consumption is because prices tell us that information if you leave prices be. Not fixing prices, not destroying prices, but if you leave prices be to the market, we know that information. But you cannot know that information if you destroy that information. That's what the economic calculation problem is all about.
Now, as I was talking about earlier, the Socialist Society may also have some kind of labour vouchers. Now, what these are is essentially what people's wages. People go out, they work, and then they get labour vouchers corresponding to the amount of labour that they've actually contributed. These are different from typical currency in that they don't circulate because they're destroyed in use. But you can still kind of compare them to a currency. What's also important to note about them is that they correspond to the actual labour that the worker has contributed rather than the wage that they've determined with a capitalist and then, not having given their surplus value that they've created, which is the profit of the capitalist. But that's a different topic.
He completely ignores the fact that that would be based on the idea that individuals that work for the fruits of their own labour. It's based on this theory. It's a bastardised theory, that is, because it's not even a theory of communism, it's not even a theory of socialism, but it's this idea that individuals, depending how much work they put in, they get rewarded for it. Nah. Socialism is the complete rejection of the individual. Do you know what that means? It means that you as an individual do not get to keep the fruits of your own labour. That's it. Full stop. You do not even get to own your own possessions as an individual. You don't get to shop around as an individual. You do not even get to own your own possessions through your own choice as an individual, because that's nothing to do with communal ownership of property. Personal means belonging to or affecting a particular person rather than anyone else, of or concerning one's private life, relationships, emotions rather than one's career or public life. Even in this dictionary definition, it says of relating to a particular person, private. The dictionary definition of personal could not have been clearer of what it means. Collectivism is the subordination of the individual and the individual's rights. It is not my opinion. It is a fact that communal ownership rejects, completely 100% rejects the individual with personal ownership.
Now, you will have some kind of immediate idea of the value of commodity through the pricing system of the labour vouchers. The amount of labour vouchers that a commodity is worth will be based on its socially necessary labour time. The higher, the more labour vouchers. So that will immediately give you some idea of relative value if you need it quickly. But you can also again see where people are actually spending their labour vouchers as well to determine demand if the statistical analysis isn't good enough.
Right, folk, he's completely redefined socialism and fitted it around capitalism. That's what he's done. That explanation there of consumers, leaving it down to consumers to basically go and shop around, as individuals that is, to shop around and determine how much is to be produced and what's to be produced, etc, etc. He's basically saying, okay, well, my socialism doesn't work, so we'll just use capitalism and then we'll relabel it and kid on that socialism.
No reason it wouldn't be, I can't think of, but if someone takes problem with that, well then, yeah, people will be spending their labour vouchers on certain things, so that will allow you to have an idea of demand through that as well. The idea is that labour vouchers only apply to commodities that are luxuries and can't be produced in abundance. As the socialist society progresses, more and more resources will be able to be produced in abundance, and eventually you'll have the full communism where everything is in abundance, and by that point it doesn't really matter how efficient you are because you have more of the resource and you know what to do with.
Again, folk, socialists are utterly clueless about scarcity.
But even then, if you wanted to be, you could just still apply the same methods talked about for the socialist society but to the resource abundant commodity, just not with the labour vouchers, but that's still fine. So you can distribute resources under a socialist economy using their socially necessary labour time, giving the relative values of the commodities, and then compare them to one another. And you can determine the demand through statistical analysis and the way that labour vouchers are being used and priced. So this means we do actually have all the necessary information to allocate resources in an economy because of the labour theory of value. Once again, the economic calculation problem assumes that markets are the only real way to determine value of a commodity.
He's just said that obviously, this proves that it isn't just the market that can do such a thing. What does he think the market is? The market is defining that of the consumers being the ones who drive what production is, etc. Well, what did he just say? He says that now he's going to have such a system of individuals shopping around with their, labour vouchers, consumers determining what demand is, etc., and what's to be produced. I mean, that's capitalism.
I mean, the fact that labour power is the source of all value in society is the reason we're able to do away with markets and all the problems that come with them. It's also worth mentioning, though, that while I can give a detailed plan for you right here, ultimately it doesn't really matter, because it's kind of down to the society itself how they're going to structure their economy. It's always going to be different what's required for different contexts, so, different places in the world, different times in history. Ultimately, no plan that we can give is going to actually translate completely well into the real world, but the at the very least, you can give a rough overview or approximation of kind of like a general feeling of how it might be done.
That's a concession, people. He acknowledges the fact that the real world is a very different place, and he used the key word there, plan. To plan. And that is what socialism is all about. That's a very big part of socialism. What defines socialism is all down to the plan. And if you're going to have to plan for 65 million people across a large country, and that of having, trillions of different products, you've got no choice but to have a strong central planner.
The thing is, Marxism is meant to explain how socialism kind of naturally and inevitably comes out of capitalism when capitalism inherently falls apart, which, without sounding like too much of a doomsday preacher, taking into account the current environmental situation and the fact that bourgeois economists themselves are predicting economic crashes within the next 5 to 10 years.
Oh, here we go again. He's going on about market crashes, etc., and he's trying to call them bourgeoisie, etc. As far as I'm concerned, most economists today are all Keynesians, and it was Keynesians that bloody well caused our mess. To say that capitalism led us into this economic crisis is just laughable, to say the least, given all the fractional reserve banking, etc., and trying to fix interest rates and bloody well, driving inflation through the roof. And if it wasn't a case of that, it's other problems with this mixed economy of the public and private sector, and strangling the private sector half to death through all of the government regulation. It's one of these things that they just don't even know what capitalism is, and then they just kind of hope that you buy into that. They hope that you believe that's what capitalism is, so that then you can point the finger and say, oh, it was all capitalism's fault. We're in this mess because of the mixed economy, because of what socialism's been doing. That's why we're in this mess. Not because of capitalism, because of socialism.
We still haven't recovered from the 2008 one, and we don't have any credit system to fall back like we did in the 70s. Well, the downfall of capitalism could be sooner than we think.
In other words, folk, we're in this mess, and he says that we're not over the 2008 financial crisis. He's correct in saying that. But guess what? That was all thanks to all of his socialist government subsidies that continue to bail out failure, failing to let failure fail. Had that been a capitalist system, those bad banks would have went under, would have faced liquidation, the taxpayer wouldn't even have paid a penny, and things would have went on as normal. We wouldn't have faced the 2008 financial crisis if you lived under a capitalist system.
Anyway, Marxism mainly explains why socialism arises from capitalism. When capitalism came out of feudalism, people weren't sitting around saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. Or the people who were running away from their lords weren't saying, we're doing capitalism. They were just doing what made sense to them. It's only after that the system was established it was given a name. And kind of the same thing could happen with capitalism.
It's false, folk. The name capitalism did come around, during that period, but Britain was not capitalist. Britain was strongly mercantilist. Never mind that fact, however. The point is the name capitalism actually stems and derives originally from what is meritocracy.
These societies naturally develop due to the historical and material circumstances. The same will happen for socialism. That's not to try and shift the responsibility of explaining the workings of socialism off me. I think I've already done an alright job at that here. But it's just to point out that at the end of the day, it is down to the society.
So you get the gist of the argument, folk. I've covered everything in relation to his argument. It's a very, very poor argument. He doesn't understand anything to do with the economic calculation problem. He seems to think that he can have his own version of communism, which completely defies the entire meaning of it. And it's almost like as if he's saying, I reject the market, but I'm clinging on to the market. And at the same time, I'll have communal ownership, but I'll have personal ownership. It's like, where do you even go with that? Jimmy Tralreja goes on to say, very comprehensive video. Ash Sartar is complete idiot. She always gets owned. I love your videos. Love from India. Well, Jimmy, obviously I greatly appreciate your support and everything. And sadly, India, as I explained in that video, had went through such a torrid time. Yeah, it's more mixed economy today. It isn't exactly perfect. But I'll tell you something. India's far better off now than what it was was years ago because of socialism. But you can tell she's utterly clueless. She doesn't know the first thing of what she's even talking about, and it's pretty much like that of Xexizy. You know, they just talk about all this theoretical nonsense. They don't even understand the theory of, you know, communism, etc. PB mentions libertarianism, do whatever you want as long as you're not stopping other people from doing whatever they want. Make whatever decisions you think are best for you as long as you're not forcing other people to make decisions that you think are best for them, even if you know are an absolute fact that those decisions you want to enforce are objectively good to that person. But remember, if your decisions have consequences, nobody should take responsibility dealing with those consequences but you. With great freedom comes great responsibility. It's all down to individual responsibility. That does not mean to say that under a capitalist system that people just turn a blind eye to those who are less fortunate, etc. But there's a difference between that of coercively going about things, which of course socialists seek to do, and that of doing things through voluntary action. SH says, I have a feeling this fully automated luxury communist folks played SimCity or Cities Skylines, and then they thought this is how an economy works. PS, they probably used cheat codes and mods to understand the economy through their gameplay. They probably think of it as some sort of game, etc. It just happened to be that Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, was them trying to put things into practice and everything turned out pure comedy. And that pretty much sums up the type of people that you're arguing with. That is these socialists. They honestly don't have a clue about the real world. Jean Myra says, in Soviet Union all people had employment, but all lived almost like slaves. The people were hungry. Well, that's the thing, Gene. At the end of the day, in the Soviet Union, and even an argument by Henry Hazlitt, he said the full employment level is unsustainable in the economy. They basically lived as slaves. They were living under totalitarian dictatorship. Even in the 1930s, during their honeymoon period, where socialists tried to call it democratic, it was totalitarian. And these labour camps, etc., they even painted them as happy, peaceful places. The Soviet Union was faced rife with that of surplus-based problems and shortage problems in relation to the economic calculation problem. It was a horrific regime that massacred more than 20 to about 60 odd million people. Entertainment Garrett goes on to say, the intro bit was so well done. If your content was more similar to that, I'm sure you would grow very quickly. You know, at the end of the day, I do from time to time try to be more creative and stuff like that. The more that you guys interact, such as commenting, sharing, of course, when you playlist things, when you share, the more you interact, the liking the videos always, you know, it helps. And I'm sure that over time it will grow. So again, I greatly appreciate all the support and everything. Be creative from time to time to produce content like that. So anyway, folk, I've went on long enough. I hope you've enjoyed the video, but it's been educational enough for yourself. You can go and watch the videos I explained on the economic calculation problem. And like I said, he just doesn't have a clue what he's speaking about. So anyway, folk, thank you for watching the video, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.